we're going to have Joel Arber, who's our managing consultant and group head of business development for the Sums Group, to lead us into things. And then he'll hand over to David Becker, principal consultant for the Sums consulting team. And I'll pop back up at the end to help you with some Q&A. So Joel, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Marion, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's a topic that is central to many universities thinking at the moment. How can we deal with those challenges that many universities are facing on the financial front, whilst remaining true to our people who are, let's face it, underpin our institutions. We are, at the end of the day, service businesses. So we're going to explore that in a little bit more detail today. Perhaps just to start off, I thought it would be worth reminding ourselves how things were before that thing called COVID, because I do recall at the beginning of this financial year doing a relatively similar presentation that was focused on us being in the middle of a perfect storm, that series of issues that were affecting our finances as universities, not least that demographic nadir of 18-year-olds, which we rely as a sector so heavily upon for income, but also compounded by other key factors. So that sense that we were disconnected with the public on the issue of Brexit, that we'd fallen out of love with government and were no longer able to influence policy in quite the way we should be for a sector of our knowledge and power, because we'd rubbed up against them on all sorts of challenging issues over the previous 2 or 3 years. So it wasn't a pretty picture. And how that was translating, if you look at the HESA stats, at the end of the last financial year, a whopping 61% of our institutions in the sector were already in deficit. Now, I do recognise that a lot of that was about the pension re-evaluation, but in many institutions, there are some underlying financial challenges. So with that as a background context, what were universities already trying to do to get ahead of the game? Well, for some, they were already at a point where those financial challenges were causing them to drive forward efficiency programs. Many of them were doing it on the back of immediate needs, trying to make very, very rapid savings to actually realize savings this financial year. Others had seen the challenges coming 3 years down the pipe, so were trying to get ahead of the game. But the sorts of challenges that we were seeing were being translated into quite substantial cost efficiency programs, maybe 20 million in terms of scale, losing jobs being at the heart of it, some of which was focused on reshaping for the future. But we also had seen quite some blunt instruments being used. Let's just cut 10%, say. Blunt instruments that really we don't think are the right way forward for what are fairly sophisticated challenges to reshape our institutions for the future. A few universities that we were working with had already seen the light and were reshaping, doing that future proofing, working out how their strategic objectives could be better delivered, particularly by the professional services, being more efficient and more effective going forward. One of the great challenges in all of this, particularly when you've got a big ticket cost saving to make, though, is that we can't behave in quite the same way that we always have. Universities have largely grown organically, and we'll come back to that later. But there's that reality that actually you do need to invest to grow some areas. And that's something that universities really do need to get their heads around as a sector. This is relatively new thinking, bizarrely, but we can learn from sectors beyond our own about things that might help us in that space. And Sum's perspective, having worked with universities across the sector, from very, very research intensives through to very, very teaching intensives, and every variant in between, one thing we've absolutely seen and recognized in every conversation with universities that we have about efficiency is that one size does not fit all. Solutions need to be bespoke to each institution's setting and context. That really, really is important. There are no magic bullets here. So we talked about burning platform. That really has been what COVID's done here. It's taken a sector that was already presented with significant challenges on a range of fronts, notably financial, but well beyond. And it's thrown on gasoline and lit the match. COVID is really an opportunity. It's that burning platform, but see it in a positive frame of mind. A chance to change the sector for good, for the better. To right some of the wrongs that have been allowed to happen over the last 10 to 15 years of pretty much unrivaled growth. So we've been talking, through the SUMS network, but also through our purchasing consortium network, Southern Universities Purchasing Consortium. We've been talking with leaders from across the sector about their experiences in COVID, what they could do, what they've learned, what they could do better next time, and also about their visions for the future, how they see COVID being that catalyst to positive change. And three core themes are coming through. Unsurprisingly, the first one, and the one we're probably going to focus on most in today's webinar, is that actually you need to embrace those financial challenges. This is an opportunity to transform our institutions. Yet there's been great developments on the digital front. Many IT directors that we've spoken to have been lapping up COVID. It's been a challenge for them, but it has catapulted through their change agendas in a way that has just not been possible before. I think of my own experience as a PVC at the University of Central Lancashire. I try to avoid getting on Teams like the plague. Now I live my life on Microsoft Teams, and universities are doing this across the country. That digital transformation has been given an absolute shot in the arm by COVID. The other thing that people are telling us is, my God, we are too rigid. We start an academic year in September, we finish in July, and that is pretty much how it's been for the last 100 years. And our business is high risk because of it. What about changing things around so that we're less tied to that old-fashioned academic calendar? Put greater control in the hands of our customer, the student, recognizing that we are research institutions as well, but let's focus on students for the purpose of this strand. Actually reorganizing things so that it's more student-centric. You've got perhaps as many as 6 opportunities to start on a course during the course of a year. Roll on, roll off, potentially. Lots more flexibility. And ultimately de-risking our business so that we're not so reliant on boatloads of students turning up on campus for a traditional 3-year degree come September. This is an opportunity for positive change. So back to that issue of organic growth. We've gotten fat. We've enjoyed the good years. And they have been good, sustained growth for pretty much every institution over what is now quite a long period of time. But beyond chasing student numbers as a means to growth, a lot of the growth hasn't been particularly strategic. And I think what we're left with is a problem of size and shape. So you throw in COVID and the other financial challenges, and suddenly you've got a wicked problem. You've got sharp income challenges colliding with escalating operating costs. For many, many institutions, and David will share more data on this going forwards, the cost, the number of students, the cost of students has risen. Yeah, absolutely. The income from students has risen. But the cost of running organizations, staffing costs, have risen at a sharper rate for many. That has given us some real challenges, not least because of that pension burden that I referenced earlier. So very, very important that we get our heads around this. The other key thing to reference here is that our institutions in the UK have done everything they possibly can, in the main, to be self-sufficient. That's given us, through growth, big infrastructures for what are still relatively modest-sized institutions. So again, let's return to that HESA data. Only 29 of our 194 HEIs had 20,000 FTE or more in terms of students. That's not very many. Yeah, sure. Research intensives have lots of research staff. But if you look at the staffing ratios here, 64 of our institutions have more than 2,000 staff. So there is an imbalance. And that imbalance is now at such a point where there are more administrators in universities on average than there are academics. It now sits at 54%. In 22 of our institutions, that ratio is as sharp as 60-40 in what might be described as the wrong direction. So you think back to that organic growth where we've allowed a proliferation of programs and research centers to be developed. We have supplied each of those with the infrastructure and professional service support required to run that. And suddenly we've got real inefficiency in many of our institutions. Ratchet that up with those acute income challenges, and suddenly we're having conversations with universities not about saving £20 million, but actually up near £100 million. So of a totally different order. I'll come back to that word opportunity. We can't see this as anything other than an opportunity to fundamentally change the way we do things going forward. I'd like to hand over to David now to take you a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of how to approach this wicked problem and keep people in our thinking at the centre of it. David.
Thanks very much, Joel, and good afternoon, everybody. We've got a diverse audience with us today in terms of job titles. Just looking down the list, we have senior finance professionals, business change managers, HR colleagues, even PhD researchers, and indeed a couple of friendly faces from other consulting firms as well. So a really warm welcome to all of you. Now, I don't know about you, but in this post-COVID world, I always find it helpful to know that there are some real life people at the other end of the line. So with the aid of modern technology, hopefully, I'm going to hope that a poll will appear on your screens fairly shortly, asking you to choose which aspect of the content today you're most interested in. And if you could go ahead and just make a quick choice here, it's going to serve two purposes. Firstly, letting me know that I'm not just talking at myself, which is very much a live risk in this strange world we live in at the moment, but it'll also give me the chance to tailor some of the session today according to audience interests. So I can see, thank you to those of you who are doing the poll at the moment. Interestingly, it's human impact of cost reduction, which people are seem to be most interested in. So that's good. I'll be talking about that a great deal. And I'll balance that with some of the specific tactics as well that universities are using to drive forward their cost efficiency agendas. So thank you very much for participating there. We are hoping we have time for Q&As at the end, so do feel free to send in any questions or comments as we go along. We'll either pick them up at the end, hopefully, or if not, we'll come back to you by email afterwards. So what I'd like to do today is build on the overview that Joel's just given us by discussing some of the options and the perils around organisational change, really, particularly as it relates to efficiency and cost optimisation. And I suppose when I stand back and I look at the mistakes that universities have historically made when they've pursued major efficiency programmes in the past, there are really two that come to mind more than any other. And the first is efficiency programmes that have been based more on intuition or shaky evidence than robust intelligence, and where consequently any savings that a university has made have been almost as detrimental in the medium term as they were helpful in the short term. And the second is efficiency programs that through either process or outcome have lacked some of the fundamental pillars of fairness and decency that really should be at the heart of any public service organisation. So what I want to specifically take a look at in the next 25 minutes or so is what it means to be a principled organisation at a time of financial worry, and examine whether it's possible to drastically reduce costs while staying true to the values of your organisation. And to do that, I'm going to look at three things, principally. So firstly, the necessity of cost reduction at the moment, including the most common approach we see that we'd say should almost always be avoided, and give you a summary of the kind of thing you can aim for instead. We'll take a look at the other tactics that might be open to universities to deploy when the need to cut costs is paramount, and a couple of tools that maybe can help you with that. And finally, and most importantly, given where audience interest lies today, some of the basic building blocks to organisational decency during times of contraction. And if there's one component which binds all three of those objectives together for me, it's probably the use of good management information to provide a solid platform for decision making. So I'm going to advocate quite strongly in this webinar for big doses of both empathy and integrity during times of cost reduction. But what I'm certainly not going to argue for is that things are just fine as they are. And a really obvious place to start looking why I believe changing the sector is necessary is the data. So Joel mentioned that almost 120 of our universities were loss-making at the moment. And what the breakdown that you see here on this slide shows you is that sector expenditure over the last 4 years has increased by more than £11 billion. That's around a 34% increase, which is a staggering percentage when you think about it. But where it gets particularly interesting is when you break that expenditure down into its component parts. And when you do this, you can see that there's actually been significant increases in spend across all categories of expenditure over that time period. And the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted particularly that non-academic staff costs, which have risen, now stand at more than 28% of overall expenditure in the sector. That's up from around 24-25% in previous years. So it isn't just the case here that costs have increased, it's that the proportion of spend on non-academic staff across the sector has increased too. Now, there's context to be added to the data. We've had more than 30 new providers who've entered the market in the last 4 years. Joel mentioned pension re-evaluation costs. But actually, when you look at the figures, neither of those things fundamentally change the overall narrative that ours is a sector that has been spending big and it's been getting bigger. So the data we have available to us at SUMS lets us run this kind of inquiry at an institutional level too. And the spend profile at most universities we do our work with is broadly in line with this sector-wide trend, and sometimes actually even more extreme. So in amongst this data, it's possible to find a category of university that's particularly at risk. And those are represented here by the red dots in the upper left quadrant. And what this shows you is that there's a not insignificant number of our universities, some of them reasonably large institutions, which have been recording steady decreases in student recruitment at the same time that their expenditure in central administration has grown. And if there was ever a recipe in the current marketplace for warning sirens to start going off, then that is it. But I suppose the real kicker is that all of this data predates the pressures of COVID. So even the most optimistic estimates of student recruitment for the coming year show declines in student numbers across all markets, particularly international. And the consequence of that is that many of those universities in the top right quadrant, which have been growing student numbers and growing expenditure, will actually find themselves quickly moving into the red as the reality of this pandemic bites. There are some universities who have approached this already in a very considered, circumspect way, but the severity of the financial impact in some universities has naturally triggered a desire to take very speedy decisions about how to rapidly make cuts to the cost base. And those are decisions in some instances which are being made before institutions have moved into a longer term dialogue about how they could better reconfigure their operating model to actually survive and thrive in the post-COVID world. And the problem we observe with the most common of these quick decisions is that they quite frequently don't deliver the benefits that are desired, whilst also risking substantially damaging staff morale. And I'm going to talk about a few reasons why that is. So in a typical university, well over 60% of its operating cost is made up of staffing. So you can see immediately why headcount reduction happens in times of crisis. And in instances where a university is projecting losses of more than £100 million over the next few years, it's almost naive to think that staffing wouldn't need to form some part of the process for becoming more efficient. But there are several problems with this as a concept and as an approach, and particularly so with any framework that sees every service area asked to make the same percentage cut. There have been innumerous studies over recent years of organisational performance following staff layoffs. And no matter which sector you look at, the findings are always consistent. Firstly, that any effort to take staffing costs out of the business without also reducing the portfolio of activity the business undertakes is unsustainable. We've actually tracked this through ourselves using data from universities that have implemented across-the-board cuts a few years ago. And without exception, the cost they took out at the time has crept back in. It's partly because peak times of year have hit or demands have kept increasing, and that's left them with little choice but to appoint fixed-term staff, interim managers, agency workers, contractors. But also one of the biggest drivers of inefficiencies in professional services is actually an academic portfolio which has proliferated out of control. And universities generally find it far harder to bring order to that side of the house. For as long as you cut professional services without addressing the academic business as well, it's almost impossible to make sustainable cuts. Secondly, and more importantly for me, there's no organisation ever that's managed to cut its way to strategic relevance, which is not to say there aren't a great many firms who every year make decisions to redivert their investment from one area to another, losing staff in the process. But when that happens, it's almost wholly a decision of strategy and not of cost control, and I'll come back to that shortly. Thirdly, although the pandemic has derailed so many things about all our lives, there is still hope in the scientific community that a vaccine is going to be available within 2 years. And if that hope is borne out, any university which has imposed blanket cuts during this period may well find it significantly harder to scale back up and could have manoeuvred themselves into a position of competitive disadvantage at the same time as damaging morale of their best asset in the form of their staff. There's also a really fundamental problem with the framework through which universities tend to make these decisions. And it's the continuing mismatch between the diversity of each university's staff community and the wholly inadequate representation of that diversity in decision-making structures at universities from the Board of Governors downwards. So we're already aware of the disproportionate impact that some proposed reductions are going to have on women and on Black and minority ethnic staff. And for as long as the sector's slow progress towards true representation continues to be slow, then it simply embeds common thinking patterns around cost reduction tactics and really makes it very difficult for issues to be considered through a more diverse lens. So an underlying principle of everything I've said so far and everything I'm about to say is that there can be no decency without diversity, and that's a core pillar of one of the things I want to talk about. So if we move back to the fundamental premise, which is that costs in many of our universities do still need to be addressed, I thought it might be instructive to share with you just some of the tactics we're starting to see other universities deploy in the interest of survival. This isn't an exhaustive list, but if you're a SUMS member, just leave a note in the chat box and we'll send you the full list after the webinar. I've referenced the importance of equality and diversity, but two more obvious components of organisational decency in times of cost reduction that I hope few people would argue with are, firstly, it's not really fair to reduce staff cost unless and until you've addressed inefficiency in your non-pay spend. And there's plenty of inefficiency in universities' non-pay spend. And secondly, in times of trial, it's really those with the broadest shoulders who should bear the greatest burden. So with respect to the first issue, we find that every university has potential to make savings of around 5% of its impactable spend through improved procurement. As you'd expect, the SUMS Group does a lot of work in this area. And actually the average savings per university that we've identified through our procurement VFM assessment, it actually sits at around £2 million cashable, which is a lot of people's salaries. Given industrial relations, I think we can expect to be difficult enough during times of contraction. If you are front-loading staff cuts without also being able to demonstrate that you're sensibly squeezing what you can out of non-pay, whether that be through procurement or the estate, then you're probably asking for problems. And if we turn to the broader shoulders principle, in fairness to our vice-chancellors, a great many have now taken substantial pay cuts. I know those VCs at Bristol, King's, Edinburgh, Nottingham Trent are amongst many who have done so. And it's probably worth noting that the actual savings from those measures are relatively insubstantial, but they are a good example, I think, of how university leaders can embed decency within their approach to leadership. Certainly it gives those VCs greater credibility to push forward with other cost control measures if they can demonstrate that they themselves have been prepared to be materially affected by the crisis. It's also instructive to cast our eyes over the pond to the United States, I think. And again, much more detail on these measures is available to SUMS members if you want to drop us a note in the chat box and let us know you would like them. But in summary, what we're seeing at some US universities are alternatives to headcount reduction in the form of tiered furloughs and tiered salary cuts. The general approach with tiered furloughs is that those on very high income brackets, say £100,000 or more, might be mandated to take 4 weeks additional unpaid leave over the course of a year. Those on salary brackets of say 75,000 to 100,000 might be mandated to take 3 weeks additional unpaid leave over the course of a year. And that cascades downwards through the institution with the option to protect workers on lower salary bands. And it's a similarly tiered option with salary cuts. So in essence, higher earners will take a bigger percentage reduction than lower earners, perhaps with those on salaries below a certain threshold exempt from those arrangements. And the quid pro quo with those models is that the university is essentially agreeing not to make any redundancies as a result of a COVID-19 impact for a fixed period of time. Now, these aren't scenarios either which will have people singing from the rooftops, and they are scenarios that will still necessitate consultation with staff and with unions. But nonetheless, they're a means of protecting jobs while saving substantial sums of money, potentially tens of millions of pounds, and avoiding hasty decisions pending any certainty about how the long-term effects of this pandemic play out. Now, none of this is to say that our universities shouldn't seize the financial challenges of COVID to finally tackle a number of their long-standing issues, as Joel said. The time is right to be very ambitious about future operating models. The time is right to move away from a culture that staff belong to a particular department rather than the university. But the emphasis has to be on doing this speedily, but because of strategy and not because of panic. So I'd like to focus the remainder of my time in this session on some principles behind a better approach to cost management. And the column on the left captures what that might mean in terms of cost control, and the column on the right is just a few of the building blocks of decency which universities always need to be committed to. As ever, for SUMS members, much more detail on this checklist of what decency means in times of change if you want to drop us a note. My first point would be that terminology is important here. So when we see or refer to staff principally as costs to the business, we're doing them a grave disservice. If you flip that on its head, you can actually see any cost within any university as an investment in its strategic ambitions. And you'd have to be hard-hearted indeed not to think that staff are one of the most crucial of those investments. But as in our personal lives, I guess some of those investments pay off and some don't. But in our personal lives, with our personal financial investments, there's one instinct we have which is probably stronger than any other, and that's to protect the investment, not to gamble it away recklessly. And when you start to approach staff as an investment in terms of conversations around organisational change, rather than as a cost, it takes you to a different place in your organisational thinking, which is much less about how can I cut those costs which are clearly too high, and much more about how can I retarget investments into those areas which will have the biggest impact in advancing the university. There are several models which we use to support universities who are currently locked into that kind of change process. And whilst there's just not the time to go into those in any detail here, I thought I would just share with you some of the higher level tools that can help in moving away from the notion that it's staff costs that need to be cut, rather than investment in activities that needs to be reconfigured or rediverted. So there's one underlying principle at the heart of this tool, and it's that every single activity that takes place in a university falls somewhere on the spectrum between business critical and dispensable. Now, I accept we're in a situation where the dispensable and the nice to have activities are pretty thin on the ground, and that does leave some universities in a place where they might have to stop doing things, but the things they stop will still have value. So the analogy I might use in a non-work context is Shakespeare. I live near Stratford-on-Avon. I love Shakespeare. Prior to the pandemic, I try to get to a play at least once a month. My world would be a poorer place without Shakespeare. But I wouldn't cease to exist if Shakespeare's plays were taken away. And in a university sense then, you can accept there are no easy choices anymore, but it is still possible to instill some nuance into your cost reduction choices. And you can take a tool like this and define the parameters on each axis further in the way that's right for your organisation. But crucially, and as I've said on the slide, to make the best of it, you really do need to have an enterprise-wide view of all the activities taking place in your university's name. And surprisingly or unsurprisingly, there's not too many institutions who can say that they do have that. This is one of several tools we might use when we're doing business design work with universities. And I wanted to show it to you because it's another way of assessing performance of your existing professional service provision against several dimensions of capability as set out in those wheels. So again, there are different parameters you can use within this tool to conduct the assessment. You could complement it using data from official staff surveys. It could be set up as a business change project. You could even run the exercise independently using any one of the excellent consulting firms that support UKHE, hopefully with sums at the top of that list. And insofar as this relates to cost reduction, the outcomes from the exercise can help you make much more informed decisions about where investment is most needed across the entirety of your professional services space, but also give you an indication of where service levels might be gold plated, when actually some of them could probably be simply good enough. So my final point on cost reduction is that, like it or loath it, higher education's in a competitive landscape now, where our income is more exposed to market fluctuation than at any other time in history. And so we can't afford to keep running into the need to deliver these ad hoc cost reduction programs, which lead to real disenfranchisement among staff and which universities still aren't particularly skilled at doing in an empathetic way. And for that reason, we'd advocate for a move towards strategic cost optimization as standard. And whilst unpacking cost optimization might take several webinars in itself, and who knows, perhaps we'll do some of those in the coming weeks, the fundamental purpose of it is to instill a university-wide continuous discipline that drives spending, controls costs, and targets investment to those areas that might give you strategic advantage. But everything I've said here about cost reduction today counts for very little unless it also takes place within a framework of fairness and integrity. And that's really where I want to finish this section. Any one of these principles on the right-hand side of the slide is worthy of a discussion in itself. But on the basis that we're already seeing a great many staff leaving our universities at the moment and several on furlough who expect to in due course, I thought I'd just dwell briefly on the kind of support that universities should really be looking to put in place for them, and which surprisingly many don't. And the reason for that is that the staff who leave your institution should still be ambassadors for your university once they've left. You don't want them to be disenfranchised by the experience of the cost reduction process or the outcomes. And it might be easier said than done, but to that end, a good investment for universities is to offer a really outstanding set of outplacement services. And a few ideas for that might be to move away from the notion that outplacement services are simply around resilience workshops or how to write a CV. We're in a modern world. They don't cut the mustard anymore. Staff need to know how to develop a LinkedIn profile. They need support in developing rich content for it, learn how to exploit LinkedIn's unique algorithms, how to stand out for the crowd when applying for new roles. It's the provision of expert application and interview support long after staff have left your university, the provision of specialist advice on quality of draft job applications, linking staff up with the right recruitment agencies, setting time aside within their work allocation, even within any notice period, to allow them time to job hunt. It's the provision of coaching and mentoring services to help staff identify development needs or to work through their own barriers and vulnerabilities. And with universities, it's the opportunity to deliver vastly discounted or even free of charge courses to your staff alumni network. The overall point, I suppose, is that it's very easy to talk about cost optimization or strategic relevance in isolation. But at the receiving end of every decision, there are human beings with their own worries, concerns, health issues. And that's why we really need to encourage approaches to cost reduction, which, yes, resolve a university's business vulnerabilities, but rely just as much on leaders thinking with their hearts as well as their heads. So a few takeaways from this session. Let me leave you with a few thoughts. Although short-term cuts might be unavoidable, it is possible to target them to areas which don't detract from your strategic mission. It is crucial to have good intelligence about your current portfolio of activities and where they sit on the spectrum of strategic importance. For as long as you don't have that, it's almost always going to be kind of pie in the sky decision making. Thirdly, that universities need to move away from sudden bursts of cost reduction activity. So yes, COVID-19 has been something none of us could have foreseen, but universities have been going through a cycle of growth and cost reduction for years before that. We need to move towards a culture where cost optimization is the norm. And above all else, work hard to do the right thing, even when the decisions are difficult. It's not that people will thank you for it. I'm yet to see a cost reduction program where people are delighted with how it's gone. But the aim isn't to receive praise. It's to look back and know that you acted and implemented decisions with integrity. So that's the fundamental message, I think, from this today. So let me hand you back to Joel at this point to wrap up what we've heard so far.
Thanks, David. And I think what we've heard from David there is some really creative thinking, actually, around how universities can, with integrity, with a real care for their people, still tackle the immediate challenges that finances are provoking. So creative thinking, thinking bigger, is really important now to deal with these immediate problems. But there is still a wider challenge that needs looking at, and you can't forget the human impact on those wider challenges as we seek to reshape our institutions for that long-term future as well. So in thinking through what your university might be able to do now, you also need to take the opportunity through those immediate cost savings, giving you some breathing space, to look forward and work out how actually you can make those bigger, more fundamental changes. And the starting point, again, is people, and leadership needs to be very, very conscious of that. Universities are, to all intents and purposes, service businesses. We are creators and disseminators of knowledge, yes, but it's about people. And our people are our brand. Brand's a horrible word to use in higher education. Lots of academic staff don't like it, but the reality is that how each of us in universities, academics or professional service staff, interact with colleagues, with students, with customers, with businesses, with other institutions, that is, in essence, our reputation. So engaging with those people, working with them to understand that we want them to be part of the solution and think smart about how we make decisions going forward is absolutely central to doing things right and to doing things effectively. I absolutely echo that sentiment that David shared. No one likes the outcome of cost cutting. It's uncomfortable for everybody involved, whichever side of the table you happen to be sitting on during that process. But taking a people-centric approach, engaging with people to try and get their input in a genuine way, is what authentic leadership is all about here. Authentic leadership, because actually any decisioning about the future shape of an institution needs to be focused on your university identity, your strategy, your values. And we talk very proudly in this sector about being values-based institutions, and many of us have got very similar values in our brand books, don't we? And integrity and inclusion, equality are the sorts of words we see routinely. But actually living those sentiments is absolutely central. If you want to engage staff, keep them as positive advocates, whether or not they remain with the institution going forward, because that's really, really powerful in the outside world. Inordinately powerful in the outside world. So a starting point for this big thinking is, what are you really there to do? And it won't be everything. That's been a luxury. But focusing on what core business really is and which professional services are required to deliver that core business is a great starting point. And then you can use various vehicles to think about that reshaping. So if you're one of those institutions that was in the right side of the quadrant with well-managed costs and growing income, and if you've enjoyed the benefits of the last 10 years of boom time, why don't you get on the front foot? Why don't you think positively about mergers as an option? Because, actually, mergers in universities haven't worked because there hasn't been a genuinely burning platform to drive them. But interesting to think about that going forward. Reducing recurrent costs is a big, big challenge and often requires massive thinking. But what about taking advantage of COVID? COVID is likely to change the nature of our campus space as we do far less face lectures using big spaces, and we concentrate our on-campus efforts on high quality, value-added, smaller group work. That's going to reconfigure our campuses. That gives us an opportunity. That gives us an opportunity to think commercially about using some of that space, about asset sales, about working with other anchor institutions in our places. And when it comes to working with anchor institutions, what about shared services? A number of universities are already doing this in some key areas, but there is certainly more to be done. There's plenty that our consulting team have experienced and brought to the table from local government about shared services that the higher education sector could really benefit from listening to. Real options there to work in a compassionate way with like-minded institutions that are committed to place in the same way that we are, committed to our socio-economic impact on our locales. Working with institutions like that to try and solve problems with shared solutions is quite a smart way of remaining true to our values, true to our people, and true to the impact we make as institutions on our communities, on our wider communities. But think big. That's the important message. Don't just use blunt tools like a unilateral 10%, 15% cut, whatever it is you need to make, applying to every department or every professional services. That lacks the sophistication to reshape your institution for the future. And what might that future look like? Well, a number of universities we've spoken to believe that actually COVID, the financial impact of COVID will remain with us for about 4 or 5 years. But beyond that 4 or 5 years, we as institutions need to be in the right shape to take advantage of that upturn, that real rapid upturn in undergraduate demographics as the 18-year-old cohorts start to swell in number. We want to absolutely engage those potential students, but with universities that appreciate their lives, that appreciate how they want to interact as students, as potential researchers, as potential employees of our great institutions. All sorts of things to think through here, but having people at the center of that thinking is essential. Final point, special purpose vehicles. Very, very interesting challenge. A number of universities have created these already, some with greater success than others. This does retain jobs. It is a way to keep people engaged and part of positive engagement with your institution and being part of the solution going forward, but on less punitive terms and conditions for the institution to bear. So the pensions challenges that are crippling many institutions are not such an issue going forwards if professional services staff, particularly in certain key areas, are working on different terms and conditions. It absolutely is an opportunity to retain jobs whilst fundamentally reducing recurrent costs. Certainly worth thinking about. Finally, a plug for working with SUMS. We're working with a whole range of institutions around this whole agenda. I'm not going to try and sell you this stuff. We don't come in and try and say we can do all of this stuff for you. We can't fix your problems. Only you can fix your problems. What we can do is be a sounding board. We can lend objectivity, creativity, experience from working with institutions across the sector, benchmarking, things that can help you, tools that can help you, and David's shared a few with you today. Tools that can help you as institutions make smarter decisions with people at the center of them. Do it on a modular basis. Work out where you actually need support, where you can actually, where you're self-sufficient as institutions yourselves. And SUMS can help you work through those solutions and come up with people-centric solutions that are right for your institution and its myriad customers. Because ultimately, we should be seeing COVID absolutely as a silver lining rather than as a catastrophe. It's about mindset and capitalizing on the people assets that our universities are all about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel and David. And the words that really stood out to me there were integrity and care. And I was just thinking back to some of the themes that came out of interviews with professional service staff around what universities do now will be remembered and how important that is in undertaking some of these programs. So we have a few minutes for questions. So it's not too late if people want to submit those via the Q&A. So perhaps I will throw this out to David first, but again, feel free to pipe up as well, Joel. One of our attendees was wondering what teams' functions should be bolstered and retained as opposed to cut during this process, do you think?
It's a great question, and there's no easy answer. I guess the first thing I would say, to go back to the point Joel made near the beginning of the presentation, is that there is no one size fits all in universities. So one of the things we do at SUMS, by virtue of having access to all the HESA data as well as our members' data, is benchmark the provision of different universities and look at where specific service areas might be disproportionately over or under resourced in contrast to very similar universities. So whilst I would love to be able to say, oh, never cut your marketing team, although actually in the current climate that probably isn't a good idea, never cut registry. It's more individual insights which should guide you on the decision there. So an example that comes to mind recently, I won't mention the university, but the diagnostic work we did showed that their registry costs, which they had both in central and in faculty areas, were around 38-39% higher than universities which were 30 or 40% bigger than them. And so immediately then you get into a conversation about why that is. You can delve into the data. In their instance, they had managed to get something like 11 layers of line management in place within registry and duplicated roles across the institution. So that would be an area there where a focus on business process improvement activity could actually give you some real savings without damaging the core business. So that would be my take on it. It very much depends on the data within each institution, but Joel, you may well have a different take there.
Yeah, there's no silver bullets here. Different universities have different data to draw upon. As a marketeer, I would say that marketing is the wrong thing to cut in a situation like this, particularly with that demographic upturn to take advantage of just coming around the corner. And experience from other sectors will tell you that when you cut marketing in a recession, you bounce back far slower. So that is an area to watch. I'd actually echo exactly what David has said there about investing in improved processes to reduce inefficiency. That might actually require also investment in IT systems. It's not meaning necessarily recurrent people costs, but making sure that your systems are fit for purpose and are well integrated with each other, because they're an enabler here for professional service delivery. Investment in that is often the answer to some of the challenges. But I'll turn it around, not an area to save, but an area to look for cuts. Look for duplication. Duplication is the issue, and across professional services functions, we see week in, week out in universities that lots of professional services functions in central services are duplicated out in schools, colleges, faculties, whatever structure of academic support is required. And actually being more streamlined about how those resources are deployed to help the faculty, schools, colleges, rather than necessarily duplicate. That's the key to finding efficiencies with service delivery at the center of the thinking.
Right. Okay. So not a one-size-fits-all solution, but definitely some key principles to start off on then with that one. Our next question is quite interesting. So in this person's experience, the sorts of shared service and different delivery models we've been talking about in this session can create a real tension with academic staff and students who fight to keep all staff members of that institutional community. And it can often be the academic culture that gets in the way of universities thinking big in the way that we've talked about in this session. So do you have any thoughts on how to address this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very thorny issue, isn't it? And of course, that divide of non-academic versus academic has been going on for some time. If I roll it back, first of all, to components of decency, I think one of the components of decency is almost trying to co-create solutions with all of your staffing base, whether they're professional services or academic members of staff. Now, that won't always work. You know, I've seen correspondence from UCU recently with a university which has been bending over backwards to try and do things in the right way. And UCU's response is, as you might expect, it's not been helpful, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try and engage staff in the right way. It is also a different time. So in previous times, if a university tried to be that ambitious, academic staff had the option to move to another university if they didn't like it. They could wind their students up in some instances in quite a chronic way. Every university is going to be in a very similar boat at the moment. So the options don't exist in future to just hop from one employer to another because you don't like the focus of your current university. This is something which pretty much every university faces, and it's not going to go away. And I'd also raise a point around changes or an evolution to performance management. So whether you work in professional services or in the academic community, it's not really acceptable to be winding your students up publicly via different channels. And probably there is an element of stick as well as carrot here, which universities shouldn't hold back in. And actually the stick is a component of fairness, because it's not fair to well-behaved staff to allow the badly behaved ones to get away with murder. So a bit of a multifaceted approach here to a wicked problem. But Joel, anything you would throw in there?
Yeah, I mean, we come back time and again to the importance of communication and engagement. So as David mentioned there, co-creation of solutions with people from across the business, but making sure that people understand what the commercial drivers, what the economic drivers of the challenges that are being faced by institutions are, is absolutely essential, because we as a sector cannot afford the luxury of the structures that we've got any longer. That's just a reality. That clashes hard with many of our altruistic views of the purpose of higher education. But if you look at what is at the heart of universities, that sense of knowledge creation and dissemination, ring fencing the things that are absolutely central is something that just about everybody can get behind. Explaining that not everything that is supportive or peripheral to that can remain directly in the purview of the university, but might need to change the nature of the service delivery. That's the thing to get across to people. Communication, engagement, about those realities.
Yeah, and I think there's probably some really good examples across the sector that are emerging as we go through this whole process. A question now on unpaid leave, and there's two questions on this. So I'll pose the first one to you both first. Are there any UK universities which have put in place unpaid leave options, and are there evidences, or is there evidence of savings then?
Okay, so if I go first on that one, I don't know of any universities which have moved to the point where they have been mandated, but I do know of several universities where it has been made clear that that might be something that they move to in due course. There is a university which I won't name, but part of their plan, and decency, I think, is embedded within it, is using a section of their reserves to cover this uncertain period, and they will be looking, if they can't make the savings they need to make through reserves, to try and negotiate with the unions and with staff to mandate particular furloughs or salary reductions. In terms of the savings potential, that university does think that if they did that, they could make upwards of £60 million. That's including the use of reserves, I think around £30 million off the top of my head on reserves, and the rest through tiered reductions.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anybody that's actually gone down that path in the UK, but there are some universities that have gone not a step in that direction by saying to staff that they're no longer able to carry over holiday from this year into next, so that burden doesn't sit in next year's accounts and in the operation of the university next year. So even though that people haven't been able to go away on leave, making sure that they use their leave up during this financial year is a move that a number of UK institutions have put into place, and that has actually created, we believe, multi-million-pound savings in one large university.
Okay, so one of the questions, the related question then, which actually we might not be able to speak to yet, was, if you have academics redesigning courses for online delivery and then moving right away to delivering them, how would you actually practically roll out something like mandated unpaid leave? But I think you've both spoken to that to a certain degree.
Yeah, and it's difficult to answer that in the detail, which I think it merits. But what we do have is case studies from US universities who have been through that process. So if the attendee who's popped that question in the box wants to maybe drop you a note, Marion, and let you know who they are, we can get those case studies across to them to explore that further.
Excellent. Yeah, if you just put your name and email address in the chat, I can follow up with you. And then final question, unless anything else pops up in the Q&A, is how well placed are unis generally to tackle organizational design?
Okay, well, I have a particular view on this, which is that universities aren't well placed to tackle key issues of business design, organization design. Not really their fault. Historically, the kind of units which might be responsible for that have found themselves actually just doing kind of training and development, which is not the same thing. And sometimes change teams have been brought in, but actually finding a mix of business design skills within change teams can be quite rare as well. There are some across the sector who I think have that. But even beyond the probably the inadequate capability across HR and change teams generally when it comes to business design, the organizations themselves aren't set up to it. They don't know what it means. Management speak is a big turn off to a lot of people. And I think there's a real need to, I'm a big advocate for the benefits of it, but there's a need to turn it into layman's English, kind of layperson's English, because it's just, it's almost impenetrable to some people at the moment, despite the benefits it can bring.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then just a follow-up comment on our unpaid leave. An individual, an attendee who's previously worked for a large retailer, implemented a voluntary unpaid leave program and said it was hugely popular with staff. So actually, this kind of thing may not be as unpopular as universities fear.
Yeah, thanks for the observation. It's interesting to hear that. Who knows, I suspect maybe the willingness which staff have to accept that kind of process will come down to how adequate the organisation has communicated how dire the situation is to begin with. And I suppose if you're in a situation where it's you lose your job or everyone takes a fair slice of an alternative tiered reduction, maybe there is a big potential there. Certainly in the US, it is being done.
Yeah, anything to add, Joel?
No, I think David's absolutely covered that one off.
Excellent, perfect. Well, that brings us to the end of the questions.